On this episode of Doing the Most, we're going to help you make your very first bottles of mead. This is part 4 in a 4-part series about how to make your very first home brews. We've covered how to make your first beer, cider, and wine, and on this episode, we are making mead. And this is going to be a dry mead, not a sweet mead. You can sweeten it in the glass with honey syrup or grenadine if you'd like to sweeten it up. But we're really trying in this series to narrow the scope of homebrewing content on YouTube down to its barest essentials. Only the most essential ingredients and only the most essential gear. Our goal is to get you a quick win, get you something that you can brew and be proud of in a short period of time with as little upfront investment as possible. So this is going to be a very, very simple recipe. Now we are doing some unconventional things in this process, as you may have seen in our other videos in this series. For one, we are not using an airlock. Now, an airlock is really valuable. It's a great safety mechanism to make sure that too much pressure doesn't build up inside of your fermentation vessel, because fermentation creates off-gassing, and that can build up pressure in a sealed container. If you want to use an airlock but don't want to spend money on an airlock, I get that. You could cut a hole in the top of your lid of your fermentation vessel and run part of your siphon tubing into that. Just put some hot glue around it and then run the other end of that tube into a cup of water, and that will act as a blow-off, which is an airlock. You can also thoroughly clean and sanitize a balloon, just a regular old balloon, turn it inside out, and then put that on top of your fermentation vessel, poke a hole in it to let some gas escape, and there you go, a very low budget airlock solution. Now in this video, we're going to be leaving our lid on the fermentation vessel, but not tightening it so gas can still escape. And then as we get further into fermentation, we'll be burping the lid every few hours to make sure that gases can escape. If you do want to dive right in, we recommend the Brew series of kits, and they have mead kits available that come with all the gear, including airlocks, so you'll have everything you need right from out the gate in order to get brewing like a pro. I love Brew series of kits. I think they're pretty affordable and include a lot of good gear that you're going to be able to use time and time again. And so check out the link in the description for the Brew kit we recommend to make your first mead. And we're not going to be using a hydrometer, probably the most important tool in your homebrewing arsenal. And if you're going to buy any gear, a hydrometer is the gear I would recommend you buy. Now, I will be showing you gravity readings and the ABV of this brew. But that said, not having a hydrometer is going to leave you brewing a little bit blind when it comes to knowing what's going on in your fermentation. Because the hydrometer tells you the density of sugars in your liquid, and as fermentation goes on, obviously that density goes down, and so the hydrometer gives you a finger on the pulse of what's happening in the fermentation vessel. But if you're not using an airlock and this is one of your first times brewing, I would suggest that you double all the times that I talk about in this video. Give it plenty of time to finish. I mentioned nutrients a moment ago. We're going to be using boiled bread yeast as our nutrient for this mead. Typically, I like to recommend the use of MEAD, which is an organic form of nitrogen to nutrify the must for your yeast. It gives your yeast the best opportunity for a steady, clean, and complete fermentation. So if we were using MEAD, I would give you a recommended amount of nutrient for this. Since we're using boiled bread yeast, I have already done the calculation on how much yeast you will need to boil and destroy in order to make it available as a nutrient for your yeast. So basically what we do is we calculate it as if we were using MEAD, then multiply that by 3. And that gives us the weight of bread yeast that we need to boil to use as nutrient. And we're going to be front loading the nutrient in here, so it's all going to go in up front. You don't have to worry about opening it every day and adding a little bit of a dose of nutrient to it. We're just going to front load it and let it ride. Boiling bread yeast is an easy way to inactivate the yeast and make its nitrogen available for your brewing yeast. So we're going to be boiling ours as part of our must and then just mixing it in right at the beginning. Lastly, we've got to talk about sanitizing. I like to use a sanitizer called Starzan. It's an acid-based, no-rinse sanitizer. Basically, you just mix it up, dunk all your gear in it, and let it go. You don't have to rinse it off or anything. It's ready to be used immediately after it's done sanitizing. But I understand that some of you may not want to buy an acid-based sanitizer, and for that, I've got a couple recommendations. For one, you could bring some water to 160 degrees and then put your gear in it for a few minutes. It just needs about 30 seconds at 160 degrees, but leaving it in for a couple of minutes ensures that the whole piece of gear got up to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. You can do this by bringing some water to a boil, letting it cool for 15 to 30 minutes, and then put your gear in there for a couple of minutes. Just make sure that the temperature always stays above 160 degrees for this process to work. The better solution, I think, is if you've got a dishwasher and it has a sanitize cycle, put your gear in there on the sanitize cycle with no soap, no rinse aid, just in there with hot water, and that hot water and steam and high heat will blast all your gear and make it sanitized for brewing. So you can take it right from the dishwasher into your brew room and get started brewing. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's get in here and make some mead. The gear you'll need to make this simple mead are measuring cups, measuring spoons, prep bowls, a carboy or water jug, a funnel, siphon and tubing, and bottles. If you're using crown cap bottles, you'll need crown caps and a bottle capper. If you're using standard wine bottles, you'll need corks and a corker. The ingredients for this mead are 3 pounds of honey, 1 tea bag, 1 teaspoon of lemon juice, boiled bread yeast for nutrient, and our yeast will be K1V1116. We're going to begin by pouring out some of our water. We're going to take 1 quart plus 1 cup of water out of this water jug, and we'll set those aside in case we need them later, but we need to clear some room for all the honey we're going to add. Next, we're going to pour out a cup of water to boil our bread yeast in. So bread yeast goes right in, and we'll pop that in the microwave for a few minutes to bring it to a boil. Meanwhile, we're going to add our wildflower honey into the jug. And again, we are fermenting this mead in the water jug that our brewing water came with, just to show you that you don't need any fancy gear to ferment inside of. After your yeast has come to a boil, give that a little stir to make sure you get all the clumps off the bottom. And then we're going to be adding the tea bag directly to that yeast, and we're going to let that steep for 5 minutes to infuse some of the tea tannins and make this into a nutrient tea slurry. Then we're going to continue pouring in our honey, and once you get to the last sticky bits that are sticking on the inside of the jar, you can just pour some of the water off the top of your fermenter there, back into the jar, give it some good shakes. That will introduce oxygen, which is helpful for your yeast as well as help you get the rest of the honey out of that jar. Now that all of our honey's in, we're going to add our lemon juice. This is just going to give a little bit of acidity, not really any flavor, but some acidity to the mead that helps complement the flavor of honey. And at this point, our tea is done, so we're going to press the tea bag, try and get as much of the liquid out of the tea bag as we can. And then we will discard the tea bag and add our nutrient tea slurry directly into our fermenter. You want to make sure you get every last little bit out of there. Leave no bread yeast behind. Again, this is your nutrient for your mead. Then we'll put on our lid, and I hope you're prepared for cardio, because we're going to shake this around and get all the honey mixed thoroughly throughout that batch. And now it's time to add our brewing yeast. Here we're using a wine yeast called K1V1116. It's a nice yeast that helps preserve some of the floral flavors in that honey and gives you a nice clean and aggressive fermentation. We'll just shake that up to mix the yeast throughout. And then that lid is going to go on. We'll tighten it, and then we will loosen it so that way gas can escape. So it's on there in a way that we can't really knock it off, but also it can let gas out. If you're just using a lid to protect your brew and not using an airlock, for the first 4 weeks, you're going to want to burp that bottle 3 or 4 times a day to let the trapped gas out. After 4 weeks, you can be comfortable burping the bottle once or twice a day for the next 2 weeks. At that point, you're 6 weeks in and you've probably finished primary fermentation. So it's okay to start cold crashing at that point, but you'll still want to check every few days, burp that bottle and make sure gas isn't building up, even inside of your fridge if you're cold crashing. With these processes and with an ambient room temperature of 70 to 75 degrees, and making sure to use the nutrient we have recommended, you should be able to complete fermentation in 6 to 8 weeks, if not quite a bit sooner. K1V1116 is a very reliable fermenting yeast, and so I trust it to get the job done. But because I love to harp on safety, I want to reiterate that if you're not using an airlock and this is one of your first times to brew, you probably want to double every time that I state in this video. So 8 weeks from the beginning to the end of fermentation, and a full month to let it just sit and off gas before you even think about putting it into bottles. But it is important for me to reiterate that a hydrometer, which is only a $10 to $12 piece of equipment, is the thing that will tell you whether or not fermentation has completed. Because if after fermentation appears to be done, you check your hydrometer several days in a row and the same reading shows up several days in a row, you can be confident fermentation is actually finished. Even I, somebody who's been brewing for 13 years, cannot always tell by eye whether or not fermentation is done. But if you follow the practices in this video and double all the times I've stated, you should be relatively safe. But here's my suggestion to you. Get a kit with an airlock and just let it bulk age in primary for 6 months or so. There's no reason to rush it, and this really helps ensure that fermentation is done before you bottle it. After about 6 weeks, we can be pretty comfortable that fermentation is done, even though we're not looking at a hydrometer to know that. At that point, we're going to put the entire vessel in the fridge and let it sit for 2 weeks. You may need to burp it once or twice during that 2 weeks, but putting it in the fridge is going to cold crash it, help some of that yeast and sediment drop out of suspension, and therefore help to clear your mead a little bit. And then at 8 weeks, we're going to get this into bottles. We're just going to use our auto siphon to transfer it into bottles using gravity. So we'll pump the auto siphon a couple of times and then let gravity do the rest. And we'll fill these wine bottles up just past the shoulder of the bottle. We want to leave ample room in the neck of the bottle so we can put our cork in. Very, very simple process. You could also use a bottling wand for this. Costs you a few dollars at your homebrew shop, but it helps you control the flow a little bit better because it uses a valve when you're filling from the bottom of the bottles. And this made 4 wine bottles worth of mead. All right, let's drink some mead. This mead was about 8 weeks old when we bottled it, and then it's been sitting in the bottle for about a month. When I bottled it, there was barely any CO2 off-gassing from it, so I was pretty sure that it was ready to go and didn't need more time to off-gas. But we'll see when I open it up. Maybe we'll get a little psst of gas whenever we open it here. Typically, you want your mead to be mostly off-gassed before you bottle it. That way, no additional pressure builds up inside the bottle. And an airlock is great for that because it just passively allows the gas to escape. If you're just burping a lid on top of the bottle, you kind of have to hope for the best. So again, this is my reminder that you should use an airlock. You know, mead is one of those things that you really don't want to rush, but I do understand if this is one of your first times home brewing and first time making mead, that you probably want to brew something and get in there and drink it as fast as you can. So this process will create something that's drinkable within a few months. I would recommend putting it back for 6 months to a year, let it age some, let some of those complex compounds kind of break down and marry together. You're gonna have something a lot smoother and more palatable if you give it some time. Now that said, this is 3 months old, so let's check it out. It's got a nice light straw color, a little bit of haze still left in there. If you were to leave the bottles in the fridge for a few more weeks, maybe a month, most of that stuff's gonna drop out and you can just pour delicately and leave it behind inside the bottle. But overall, for a pretty low intervention mead, the color and clarity is not too bad, especially at this age, 3 months. I always love a traditional mead where you can smell the honey right on the top of the glass. It smells fruity and floral. There's a little bit of like an orange marmalade kind of note in there, a citrusy, fruity kind of note. But dominant on the nose is honey. The honey we used for this was wildflower, so I'm not expecting extreme complexity, but if the aroma is anything to go off of, this should be pretty okay. Let's taste it. At 3 months, it's still got a little bit of heat in there. And when I talk about heat in a fermented beverage, what I mean is a perception of the alcohol. You're never gonna not taste the alcohol in a mead or a wine, but over time, that flavor will become less dominant and the other more nuanced flavors will kind of ride to the surface. Here, there's a little bit of youth still in there. Again, I think at 6 months to a year, most of that youth is gonna kind of fade away and those delicate honey notes will come more forward. Now that said, it does taste like honey. It's dry, but with just a slight perceptible sweetness. Like it almost tricks your tongue into thinking it's sweet. And that tannin in there from the tea that we use kind of helps the honey flavor cling to your palate a little bit. So it's not watery. You don't drink it and it doesn't just wash away. It kind of hangs on and says, hey, I'm mead. I'm here. It tastes like honey. Enjoy me. You know, this is probably the most rustic traditional mead experience I've had in a long time. And sometimes it's a little bit fun to get really back to the basics and make a really low intervention mead that you can appreciate for kind of the magic of what goes into making something like this. Now, most of you are probably gonna like this a little bit sweeter. And so for that, you can make some honey syrup. You just take 70% honey and 30% water, mix them up really well, and then that keeps in the fridge for a couple weeks. You can use that by just pouring some in the bottom of the glass and then pouring the mead on top of it. The honey syrup will mix throughout and it will help bolster the sweetness profile of your mead. Alternatively, you could use something store-bought like grenadine. It will change the color of your mead, but it will also sweeten it up as well. If you like this video, I hope you'll stick around. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell so you don't miss any of the future content here on the channel. And if you're a longtime homebrewer, mead maker, winemaker, leave a comment in the comment section for a beginner. Let them know some of your tips and tricks to make a really good homemade mead. Good luck on your homebrewing journey. If you missed any of the other parts of this series, I hope you'll go back and check those out. I think they're also really helpful and informative as you are coming into your own as a new homebrewer. And until next time, happy brewing and cheers.
Homemade brews and various how-tos, everything from mead to roast, bake creation, fermentation, inebriation, doing the most.